Elara learned early that death was never dramatic. It arrived quietly, settling into hospice rooms like dust, unnoticed until it coated everything. As a nurse, she walked corridors filled with humming machines, whispered prayers, and lives slowly loosening their grip. She learned how to sit with sorrow without rushing it, how to offer comfort without lying. Her hands became skilled at holding strangers through fear, while her heart practiced restraint for survival. Loving too deeply here could fracture something permanent, so Elara mastered the discipline of caring without clinging. Distance was not cruelty, it was preservation. Each shift etched patience into her bones, teaching her that love, unmanaged, could hollow caregivers until nothing remained except routine, professionalism, and exhaustion that followed her home long after sunrise every single morning without mercy. Jonah entered her carefully ordered world as disruption disguised as grief. He was restless, sharp-eyed, and visibly out of place among quiet acceptance. Ink stained his fingers, notebooks crowded his pockets, and defiance shaped every question he asked doctors. "A novelist," he said, with a crooked smile daring disbelief. Elara noticed how loss sharpened him instead of breaking him, how pain fueled creation rather than silence. Their conversations were brief but charged, glances lingering longer than necessary. Something unfamiliar stirred inside her chest, equal parts curiosity and warning. She sensed instinctively that Jonah would not fit into her rules, and loving him would demand courage she had spent years avoiding. Even meeting his gaze felt like stepping toward a future shadowed by inevitable loss. Jonah began appearing even when his uncle slept, lingering in hallways as though time obeyed him differently. He asked Elara questions beyond charts and symptoms, questions about endurance and surviving daily proximity to loss. Elara answered cautiously, offering practiced compassion instead of personal truth. Vulnerability felt dangerous in her work, something others leaned on until it broke you. Yet Jonah listened with unsettling attentiveness, as if her words mattered beyond politeness. Their conversations were brief but deliberate, often interrupted, yet they lingered long after he left. Elara replayed them during night shifts, disturbed by how easily he reached past her professional armor. She recognized the danger immediately. Attachment blurred boundaries, and boundaries preserved survival, or so she had always believed. The realization unsettled her deeply, forcing Elara to confront feelings she had buried beneath routine, discipline, and the quiet belief that emotional distance was necessary for staying whole always inside. Jonah spoke about stories that refused tidy endings, novels that stopped mid-sentence because life rarely offered closure. He talked about characters who burned through time recklessly, understanding its cruelty too well. His words unsettled Elara, awakening a hunger she had buried beneath responsibility. She admired his refusal to soften reality for comfort, even as it frightened her. Their exchanges became something she anticipated, a break from routine she pretended not to need. Attraction crept in subtly, disguised as intellectual fascination, but Elara knew better. She had watched enough grief to recognize early signs of loss. Loving him now meant living beside an invisible countdown. They never spoke directly about endings, but it shaped every kiss, every argument, every promise whispered late at night. Elara smiled and stayed, even as her chest tightened with knowledge she could not unlearn. Their relationship unfolded without illusion, built on honesty rather than fantasy. Jonah loved fiercely, throwing himself into moments as though intensity alone could stretch time. He lived in exclamation points, while Elara lived in commas and pauses. She loved carefully, measuring joy like medication, afraid happiness would demand payment later. They learned each other slowly, through shared meals, late conversations, and silences that felt safe instead of awkward. Jonah challenged her caution, teasing her restraint, while she grounded his recklessness. For a while, balance felt possible. Elara allowed herself to believe she could love without losing herself. yet awareness hovered constantly, reminding her nothing about this was permanent. She noticed how Jonah avoided long-term plans, how urgency colored his joy. Loving him required acceptance without denial, something she had mastered professionally but rarely practiced personally. When Jonah finally spoke about his health, he did so casually, as if mentioning bad weather. Elara heard everything he did not say. Years of experience translated his words into unspoken truths. She did not confront him or ask questions she already knew answers to. Instead, she absorbed the information silently, letting fear settle deep within her. Loving Jonah now meant living beside an invisible countdown. They never spoke directly about endings, but it shaped every kiss, every argument, every promise whispered late at night. Elara smiled and stayed, even as her chest tightened with knowledge she could not unlearn. Jonah asked her for coffee on a night when exhaustion dulled Elara's instincts for self-protection. She nearly declined, standing beneath fluorescent lights weighing reason against loneliness. She knew how these stories ended. She had held hands through countless final conversations. Still, something in Jonah's voice carried hesitation beneath confidence, and she surprised herself by agreeing. The decision felt small, almost casual, yet it echoed loudly in her chest. Walking into the cafe felt like stepping into another life, one without machines or whispered farewells. Jonah spoke freely, confessing fears of mediocrity, unfinished manuscripts, and anger toward time itself. Elara listened, drawn by his honesty. She laughed more than expected, startled by the sound, and it reminded her she was capable of feeling more than fatigue or restraint. For a few hours, the world narrowed to shared glances, warmth, and words, and she felt present in a way she had forgotten was possible. As the night deepened, Jonah asked about her life beyond work, and Elara hesitated before answering. She revealed fragments carefully, pieces she allowed few people to see. He listened without judgment, without trying to fix or soften her truths. When their hands brushed across the table, she didn't pull away. The contact felt electric and frightening, like acknowledging a door she had kept locked for years. Saying yes to him felt reckless, but also honest. Elara recognized
the risk, even as she accepted it. She had watched enough grief to recognize early signs of loss. Loving Jonah now meant living beside an invisible countdown. They never spoke directly about endings, but it shaped every kiss, every argument, every promise whispered late at night. Elara smiled and stayed, even as her chest tightened with knowledge she could not unlearn. Jonah loved with intensity sharpened by awareness, kissing Elara as if trying to memorize her soul. She felt cherished and frightened simultaneously, held and endangered by the same arms. Time seemed to narrow even as days stretched endlessly before them, nights filled with unspoken thoughts and futures carefully avoided. Elara began questioning whether staying was courage or cruelty. She had always believed love meant endurance, but now love demanded discernment. Summer burned bright and unforgiving, and she feared what would remain once the heat faded and reality demanded its price. Loving Jonah no longer felt limitless. It felt urgent, precious, and painfully finite in ways she could no longer ignore. Jonah's novel grew rapidly, fueled by urgency that bordered on desperation. Elara recognized fragments of herself woven into his characters, their conversations transformed into something luminous and fragile. Being immortalized frightened her, permanence clashing with everything she knew about impermanence. Jonah called it devotion, a way to preserve what mattered. Elara understood the impulse, but feared words surviving people. Still, she supported him, editing drafts late into the night, offering gentle critiques and encouragement. In those quiet hours, surrounded by lamplight and paper, they felt infinite. Elara clung to that illusion, aware it could not last. Writing became Jonah's rebellion against time, and she admired his refusal to disappear quietly, even as it reminded her how little control either of them truly possessed. As pages accumulated, Elara wondered what it meant to be remembered. She questioned whether love should leave monuments behind or fade softly with memory. Jonah believed stories granted meaning. Elara believed presence mattered more. The difference lingered between them, unresolved and tender. Loving him meant sharing space with his art, knowing it would outlast them both. She feared becoming a symbol of loss rather than a living memory. Yet she continued turning pages, helping him shape something lasting, even as dread whispered that someday these words would be all that remained of what they had shared together during borrowed time. Autumn arrived quietly, disguising decay as beauty. Leaves turned gold and crimson, easing the world into loss with deceptive serenity. Jonah's health worsened subtly, then unmistakably. Elara could no longer pretend not to see it. The hospital corridors reversed their roles, familiarity now edged with cruelty. Jonah resisted vulnerability, clinging to independence with stubborn pride. Elara struggled to balance her instincts as a nurse with her role as his lover, terrified of crossing a line she could never return from. Knowledge weighed heavily on her, every symptom translating into futures she wished she could erase. Loving him now required restraint she no longer possessed. Autumn whispered truth she did not want to hear, and grief edged closer with every falling leaf, marking time passing without mercy. She knew that this season would demand choices she had never faced before. They spoke less about the future and more about memories, instinctively shifting into preservation. Elara felt the breaking point approaching with quiet inevitability. Staying meant watching him fade piece by piece, reliving every loss she had spent years guiding others through. Leaving meant choosing survival over devotion. The realization tore at her silently, gnawing at her heart and mind. Autumn taught her that beauty often arrives hand in hand with grief, and sometimes the kindest act was knowing when to step away before love destroyed both people involved. Each smile, each touch became urgent, weighted with meaning, and she found herself savoring the ephemeral moments while dreading the inevitable pain that time would deliver with quiet, unrelenting precision. As time narrowed, Jonah loved harder. He planned spontaneous trips, stayed awake writing until dawn, kissed Elara as if trying to memorize her soul. His intensity exhilarated and exhausted her in equal measure. Every moment felt heightened, fragile, precious. Elara laughed and cried more freely, aware each memory carried weight. She felt herself unraveling beneath the pressure of loving someone she could not save. Joy hurt now, sharp and constant. Staying felt cruel, but leaving felt impossible. The tension tore at her relentlessly, growing heavier with each passing day. Loving louder could not stop time, and the knowledge settled painfully deep within her heart and body. The heat of summer had burned them both, but this intimacy was hotter still, forged in the inevitability of what they could not control. Despite the tension, their passion deepened beneath the summer sun. Jonah loved with intensity sharpened by awareness, kissing Elara as if trying to memorize existence. She felt cherished and frightened simultaneously, held and endangered by the same arms. Time seemed to narrow even as days stretched endlessly before them, nights filled with unspoken thoughts and futures carefully avoided. Elara began questioning whether staying was courage or cruelty. She had always believed love meant endurance, but now love demanded discernment. Summer burned bright and unforgiving, and she feared what would remain once the heat faded and reality demanded its price. Loving Jonah no longer felt limitless. It felt urgent, precious, and painfully finite in ways she could no longer ignore. Jonah's novel grew rapidly, fueled by urgency that bordered on desperation. Elara recognized fragments of herself woven into his characters, their conversations transformed into something luminous and fragile. Being immortalized frightened her, permanence clashing with everything she knew about impermanence. Jonah called it devotion, a way to preserve what mattered. Elara understood the impulse, but feared words surviving people. Still, she supported him.